Arya had been traveling through the void of space for nearly 5 years when she first received the signal from the Harmony Station. Her ship was old, built from salvaged parts of many different civilizations, yet it ran smooth and strong under her careful hands. The elf woman sat in the captain's seat, her silver hair braided with small crystals that glowed faintly in the darkness of the cockpit. Storm and Ember rested in their secured pods behind the main console, their breathing slow and steady as they slept during the long journey through the stars. The signal came through as a whisper, barely strong enough to register on the ancient equipment, but Arya had learned to listen to whispers over her thousands of years of life. This whisper held desperation and hope, two things that rarely traveled together in the dark cosmos. She leaned forward and began to trace the signal's origin with her long fingers dancing across the holographic keyboard. The coordinates pointed toward a location she had not visited in over a century, a space station that had been abandoned long ago by the Harmony Collective, the ancient organization of elves that had once ruled this corner of the galaxy. What troubled Arya was not the station itself, but the frequency of the signal. It was human frequency, the same kind that she had learned to recognize during her time on Earth. Humans were not supposed to be anywhere near this region of space. Their colonies were all confined to the outer rim, far from the dangerous territories controlled by the Valdran Empire and the other hostile species that prowled these cosmic waters. She reached over and gently touched the communication panel, activating the connection to the sleeping dragons. Storm's eyes opened first, glowing with that familiar emerald light that had marked him since he was just a hatchling. Ember stirred next, her crimson scales shifting in the soft light of the ship's systems. Both creatures understood immediately that something had changed, that a new mission was beginning. Storm, my oldest friend, there is someone calling from the old station, Arya said softly, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. The dragon tilted his massive head, his intelligence evident in the way his eyes focused on her face. Ember moved closer to the communication screen, her nostrils flaring as if she could somehow smell the signal through the speakers. Arya began to plot the course, her mind already calculating the dangers. The route to the Harmony Station passed through 3 contested territories. There were pirate ships that hunted in these areas, Valdran patrol vessels that would destroy anything they perceived as a threat, and worse, there were the silent ships of the void, vessels that belonged to no known faction and seemed to hunt for the joy of hunting itself. The first territory she would have to pass through was controlled by the Meridian Pirates, a ruthless group of beings from a dozen different species who had learned to work together only because destruction was their common language. Arya had encountered them twice before, and both times she had managed to avoid direct conflict through a combination of cunning and luck. She knew they would not be so easily avoided this time if they caught sight of her ship. She adjusted her course slightly, moving the trajectory down through a series of ancient asteroid fields instead of taking the direct route through open space. It would add 12 hours to her journey, but it would give her the advantage of cover and concealment. Arya reached down and pulled up a data file from her ship's memory banks. The file contained information about human technology, human culture, and most importantly, human social structures and their way of thinking. 3 years ago, during a peaceful mission to the Outer Earth colonies, Arya had been introduced to a human woman named Victoria. The meeting had been brief, just a few hours of time that she had originally intended to spend studying human music and art. But Victoria was different from the other humans she had met. There was something in the way the young woman spoke about hope and future that made Arya believe for the first time in 1,000 years that maybe humanity had something that the ancient elves had lost. Victoria had given her a crystal pendant that night, a beautiful thing carved from a rare earth mineral. On its surface were etched words in human language, words that read, "Remember that tomorrow is always worth fighting for." Arya kept the pendant hidden in a secret compartment near her heart, and sometimes when the journey grew long and the darkness of space seemed endless, she would touch it and remember Victoria's bright blue eyes and her confident smile. So when Arya heard that a human princess was in danger, when she received this desperate signal calling out across the stars, she knew immediately who was sending it. She knew because only a human would dare to send such an obvious signal into the darkness. Only a human would risk everything on the slim chance that someone might be listening and someone might care enough to help. Arya increased the ship's speed, pushing the old engines harder than she normally would dare. The vibration traveled through the hull, and she felt Storm's presence moving closer to the cockpit. The great dragon wedged himself into the space beside the captain's chair, his massive form barely fitting into the restricted area. Ember squeezed in on the other side, creating a barrier of warm scales and protective companionship around her bonded partner. The asteroid field grew denser as Arya navigated deeper into it, her hands moving with practiced precision across the controls. Large rocks the size of buildings floated silently in the void, and between them moved smaller debris and dust that had been scattered millions of years ago by some ancient cosmic catastrophe. Arya's ship was small and agile compared to the massive cargo vessels and warships that sometimes ventured through here, and that advantage was her greatest asset. Time seemed to slow down as she flew through the dangerous terrain. Each asteroid had to be calculated and avoided with perfect timing. One mistake, one miscalculation, and the ship would be torn apart by the rocks, scattering across space like the ashes of 1,000 forgotten worlds. But Arya had done this before, and her ancient elven reflexes combined with years of piloting made her as natural to space travel as birds were to flight. After what felt like an eternity of careful maneuvering, the asteroid field began to thin out. Arya could see the edge of the field ahead, and beyond it the vast darkness of open space stretched out like an infinite ocean. She guided the ship carefully through the last few obstacles, and then suddenly they were through, emerging from the chaos into the peaceful silence beyond. The Harmony station now filled the view screen, and Arya's heart sank at what she saw. The station was damaged, its outer hull scarred by weapons fire and its docking platforms twisted and bent from some massive impact. Entire sections of the structure were dark, without power, and Arya could see what looked like a radiation leak from one of the reactor cores on the lower levels. This was bad, worse than she had anticipated. A station in this condition meant whoever had sent that signal was running out of time. Arya knew that human physiology was fragile compared to other species. Without proper environmental controls, a human would not survive more than a few hours in the radiation-filled sections of a damaged space station. She brought the ship in slowly, circling the station to search for an entry point that had not been damaged by whatever violence had occurred here. There were scorch marks indicating weapons fire on multiple sections of the station, and Arya began to form a grim picture of what must have happened. Someone had attacked the Harmony station, someone had fought to take it, and whoever was inside sending that signal had managed to survive the initial assault, but they were trapped. The docking bay on the eastern side of the station appeared to be relatively intact, though scarred and showing signs of impact damage. Arya guided her ship toward it with slow and steady movements, being careful not to make any sudden maneuvers that might damage her already aging vessel further. As she approached, she could see that the bay doors were partially open, stuck in that position as if frozen in time. "Perfect," she whispered to Storm and Ember, who were now both pressing against the cockpit windows, trying to get a better view of the station. "We can fit through that opening if we approach at precisely the right angle." Arya's hands moved across the controls with the grace of a dancer, each movement calculated and purposeful. The ship aligned itself perfectly with the opening in the docking bay doors, and then slowly, carefully, the vessel slipped through the gap. Once inside the bay, the emergency lights of the station flickered to life, providing just enough illumination for Arya to see what had happened here. There were bodies floating in the bay, humanoid forms in the uniform of the Valdran military. This meant that the Valdran Empire had attacked the Harmony station. This meant that Victoria was caught in the middle of a conflict between two major powers, caught in the struggle between species that were ancient and powerful, caught in a war that had nothing to do with her but everything to do with fate and destiny. Arya secured her ship in one of the intact landing positions and immediately moved to prepare for the landing. She put on her environmental suit, a piece of technology that combined human engineering with elven craftsmanship, and checked her weapons carefully. Storm and Ember remained on the ship, their size making them unable to navigate the narrow corridors of the station. But Arya left the ramp down and told them to monitor everything. The corridors of the Harmony station stretched out before Arya like the veins of some ancient creature long since dead. Her environmental suit's lights cut through the darkness, revealing walls covered in frost and ice where the temperature had dropped below freezing in the absence of working heating systems. The signal she had received was coming from deep within the station, from the central research laboratories that had been sealed off decades ago, when the Harmony Collective had abandoned this place. Arya moved silently through the hallways, her footsteps barely making a sound despite the heavy boots of her suit.
She had learned long ago how to move through dangerous places without drawing attention to herself.
Every sense was alert, every muscle ready to respond to threat. Her ancient elven instincts screamed at her that something was very wrong in this place, that death had walked these corridors recently and might still be lingering somewhere in the shadows. She encountered the first guard at a sealed security door. The creature was not Valdrin, but something else, something that Arya did not immediately recognize. It was tall and thin, with forearms and skin that seemed to shift colors in the light of her suit's lamps. The creature was dead, slumped against the wall with what appeared to be a blaster wound through its center mass. Whatever had killed it had been efficient and thorough. Arya stepped over the body carefully, noting the angle of the wound and the residual heat still emanating from it. The guard had been dead for less than an hour, which meant she was close to something important. The sealed door had been forced open from the inside, the metal warped and twisted in a way that spoke of tremendous force applied to it. Arya could see scorch marks where someone had used a cutting tool or plasma weapon to override the locking mechanism. The laboratory beyond the door was vast and filled with strange equipment that Arya only partially understood. She recognized some of it as ancient elven technology, devices that had been used by her people thousands of years ago when they were actively trying to push the boundaries of science and knowledge. But there was other equipment here too. Human technology that had been integrated into the ancient systems, creating a hybrid network that was unlike anything she had ever seen before. And then she saw Victoria. The human princess was standing in the center of the laboratory, her hands resting on some kind of ancient control console. She was dressed in the formal robes of Earth's royal family, but they were torn and stained with what looked like blood. Her blonde hair was disheveled, and her blue eyes held a desperate kind of exhaustion that made Arya's ancient heart ache with recognition. Victoria turned at the sound of Arya's footsteps, and for a moment the two stared at each other across the vast space of the laboratory. Then recognition dawned on Victoria's face and she moved toward Arya with a speed born of relief and desperate hope. "Arya, you came. You actually came. I did not think anyone would hear my signal. I did not think anyone would care enough to help me," Victoria said, her voice trembling with emotion. She reached out to touch Arya's face, her fingers brushing against the clear faceplate of the environmental suit. "I always listen to signals that carry desperation and hope," Arya replied, her voice gentle. "I remember our time together 3 years ago. I remember your words about tomorrow being worth fighting for." Before Victoria could respond, an alarm began to sound throughout the station. Red emergency lights flashed in sequence, and a computerized voice announced that the reactor core was becoming unstable. Arya's mind raced, calculating the implications. Someone had sabotaged the station's power systems, and now the entire structure was beginning to fail. "We must leave this place immediately," Arya said, taking Victoria's hand and pulling her toward the exit. But Victoria resisted, her grip surprisingly strong for a human. "No, I cannot leave. Not yet, I have to complete the upload." Victoria gestured back toward the control console where data was still streaming across the displays. "This station holds information about a Harmony technology that could change everything. It could allow humans to travel to distant stars. It could give us the ability to protect ourselves from extinction. If the Valdrin Empire gets their hands on this knowledge, they will use it to enslave humanity. If I can upload this data to my ship and get it back to Earth, we have a chance. We have a future." Arya looked at the console and then back at Victoria. The girl was right, of course. This technology was important, and if it fell into the wrong hands, it could spell disaster for the human race. But it would mean staying in this dying station for perhaps 5 more minutes. 5 minutes during which the reactor continued to destabilize. 5 minutes during which death was becoming more and more certain. "How long until the upload is complete?" Arya asked, moving to stand beside Victoria at the console. 2 minutes, Victoria replied. "Maybe 3. The system is old and fragile. The data is enormous. It has to be compressed and encrypted before it can be transmitted safely. 2 or 3 minutes is all I need." Arya pulled her plasma rifle from its holster and turned to face the door they had entered through. 2 or 3 minutes meant staying in an environment where the radiation levels were climbing, and the structural integrity was failing. It meant being in one location where enemies could easily find them, but it meant giving humanity a chance, and Arya found that she was willing to risk everything for that chance. The station shook violently, and sections of the ceiling began to collapse. Arya moved quickly, using her ancient strength to support the falling debris and prevent it from crushing Victoria and the console. Dust filled the air and alarms continued to wail their desperate warnings. "One more minute," Victoria said desperately, her eyes fixed on the progress bar crossing the screen. "Almost there. Almost done." Arya heard movement in the corridor outside, the sound of armored footsteps approaching. The Valdren had detected their presence and they were moving in to investigate. Arya positioned herself between the approaching soldiers and Victoria, her plasma rifle raised and ready. The first Valdren soldier appeared in the doorway, a massive creature with blue-black skin and 4 eyes that glowed with predatory intelligence. Behind it came 3 more of its kind, all carrying weapons that looked far more advanced than anything Arya had encountered in her recent travels. "Step away from the human female," the lead Valdren commanded, his voice deep and menacing. "She comes with us for questioning. You, elf, may leave if you choose. This is not your concern. The human is under my protection," Arya replied calmly, "and this is most definitely my concern." The Valdren moved with surprising speed for something so large, raising its weapon and firing. Arya was faster, diving to the side and returning fire with her own plasma rifle. The bolt of energy caught the Valdren in the shoulder, and the creature shrieked with pain. "Upload complete," Victoria suddenly shouted. "The data is transmitted. We can go now." Arya grabbed Victoria and pulled her down behind the control console just as the Valdren soldiers opened fire. Energy bolts scorched the air above them, leaving trails of ionized particles and the smell of burned metal. "This way," Arya said, pointing to a ventilation shaft on the far wall of the laboratory. It was small, barely large enough for a human to squeeze through, but Arya could fit. She helped Victoria toward it, creating a barrier of cover as she did. Another massive explosion rocked the station, and this time sections of the floor began to give way. The laboratory was being torn apart by the catastrophic failure of the reactor core. Arya moved with the desperate speed of someone fighting against time itself, pushing Victoria toward the shaft and then boosting her up into the opening. "Go," Arya commanded. "Follow this shaft to the main ventilation hub. From there, you can reach the cargo bay. My ship is waiting there. But what about you?" Victoria gasped, looking down from the opening. "I will slow them down," Arya replied. "I will be right behind you." Victoria wanted to argue. Arya could see it in her face, but another explosion cut off any protest. The human princess turned and disappeared into the ventilation shaft, crawling towards safety. Arya turned to face the approaching Valdren soldiers and smiled. She had fought in wars when these creatures were still learning to build spaceships. She had ancient power and ancient knowledge, and though her body was as strong and capable as it had ever been, her spirit held the weight and wisdom of thousands of years. The Valdren charged, and Arya met them with the fury of her people, driving them backward through the laboratory and away from the ventilation shaft. She moved like a dancer, each movement purposeful and precise, each strike calculated to disable rather than to kill. She was buying time. Seconds of precious time that would allow Victoria to escape and reach the ship. A beam from a plasma rifle caught Arya across the ribs, and she felt the burning pain of the wound. But she did not stop. She could not stop. Victoria's words echoed in her mind, the words about tomorrow being worth fighting for. She kept moving, kept fighting, kept pushing the Valdren soldiers back toward the failing portions of the laboratory, where the floor was disintegrating. One of the Valdren soldiers fell through a gap in the floor, its screams echoing upward. Arya used the moment of confusion to launch herself into a side corridor, moving quickly toward the ventilation hub that Victoria was heading toward. The ventilation hub was a massive chamber at the heart of the Harmony Station, a place where air had once circulated through thousands of miles of ducts and pipes. Now most of the system was dormant, shut down by the failing power systems, leaving only emergency circulation that gasped and wheezed like a dying creature struggling for breath. Victoria emerged from the ventilation shaft into this chamber, dropping down onto a metal catwalk that spanned across the empty space below. She could hear the sounds of battle echoing through the station, the crack and hiss of plasma weapons, the deep booming shouts of Valdren soldiers, and underneath it all, A sound that made her blood run cold, the groan of metal being stressed beyond its limits. The entire station was breaking apart, tearing itself to pieces as the reactor core continued its catastrophic failure. Victoria ran across the catwalk toward the far side of the chamber, where she could see the access point to the cargo bay. Her heart was pounding in her chest and her breath came in desperate gasps. She was not trained for combat or escape, not really. She was a princess of Earth, trained in diplomacy and art and the ways of human governance. But she had learned something in the past few hours that were hidden on this station. Learned something that changed her understanding of what it meant to be human. 3 years ago when she met Arya, Victoria had been a different person. She had been sheltered and protected, kept away from the harsh realities of the universe beyond Earth's colonies. But during her studies in the years that followed, she had discovered something that the human governments did not want her to know. The Harmony Station contained evidence of ancient contact between humans and the elf civilization. It contained proof that at some point in human history, the elves had come to Earth, and they had chosen to help humanity survive rather than to conquer us. That was why the Valdrin Empire wanted her dead. That was why they had sent a strike force to capture her and ensure that this knowledge never reached the broader human population. If humans learned that they were supported by an ancient and powerful civilization, if humans understood that they were not alone and not helpless, they would become dangerous to the Valdrin's plans of conquest and expansion. Victoria reached the access point and began to work on the seal, using a small device that Arya had given her during their brief time together. The elf woman had been kind, interested in Victoria's thoughts and ideas in a way that made the human princess feel like her perspective mattered. And when Victoria had reached out to Arya across the vast distances of space, sending a signal that was almost certainly futile, the elf had come. The elf had crossed through dangerous territories and risked her own life to answer a call that most reasonable beings would have ignored. The seal hissed open, and Victoria stepped through into a narrow corridor that led toward the cargo bay. Behind her, she could hear the sound of an explosion, much closer now, much louder. Arya was still fighting, still keeping the Valdrin soldiers away from her position. The elf woman was buying her time with her life, and Victoria understood that in some way, this was the most profound expression of respect and partnership that one being could show to another. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning through the internal structure of the station. Victoria ran, her legs burning with effort, her mind focusing only on the need to reach the cargo bay and the ship that waited there. She could feel the vibrations in the floor beneath her feet, could feel the station disintegrating around her. Sections of the corridor collapsed behind her, sealing off the path she had taken, cutting off any possibility of retreat. Then suddenly she was there, bursting through the cargo bay doors into an open space filled with her personal transport vessel, a small human ship designed for exploration and diplomatic missions. She could see Arya's ship waiting on the landing platform beyond it, and between the two vessels, the open void of space filled with stars and distant light. Victoria ran toward her own ship, intending to get the data to her vessel and then make her way back to Arya's side. But as she approached the boarding ramp, she saw something that made her freeze in her tracks. There were Valdrin soldiers standing near her ship, 3 of them blocking access to the vessel. They were not moving, not attacking, not doing anything but standing there with their weapons raised. And behind them, moving with a slow and deliberate grace that spoke of supreme confidence, came another Valdrin, this one larger than the others, this one marked with symbols that indicated a rank of high command. The High Commander, Victoria whispered, recognizing the insignia from intelligence reports she had studied. The Valdrin soldier moved toward Victoria with no sense of hurry. The creature was enormous, easily twice the size of the standard military rank, with 4 eyes that burned with an intelligence that was almost alien in its intensity. Princess Victoria of Earth, the High Commander said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to vibrate through Victoria's very bones. I have been expecting you. You have proven more resourceful than we anticipated. That is admirable in a primitive sort of way. But your escape ends here. You will come with me, or this station will be purged completely, taking you and the elf woman both into the void. Victoria's mind raced, calculating possibilities and outcomes. She was trapped in the cargo bay with no weapons, no means of defense, no way to reach either of the ships. The Valdrin had her completely at their mercy. But Arya had taught her something during their brief conversation, something that Victoria had not fully understood at the time. Arya had told her that hope was not something that existed only in moments of advantage. Hope was something that could exist even in the darkest moments, because hope was ultimately about belief in a possible future, regardless of current circumstances. "I will not be going with you," Victoria said, her voice steady despite her fear. "Because I have already uploaded the data to my ship, and in approximately 90 seconds my vessel will execute an emergency launch sequence. Once that data reaches Earth, the knowledge of the Harmony Station and its technology will be disseminated across all human networks. You cannot stop it. You cannot retrieve it. You cannot make it disappear." The High Commander paused for just a moment, a hesitation so brief that most species might not have noticed it. But Victoria noticed because she had learned to read the subtle signs of Valdran emotional states during her studies of their military culture. The creature was calculating whether Victoria was telling the truth, whether the human princess had actually managed to send that data to safety. "It is a bluff," the High Commander announced finally, but there was a note of uncertainty in its voice now, a note of doubt that had not been there before. The cargo bay doors suddenly opened on the far side of the bay, and Storm came roaring through them with Ember right beside him. The two dragons filled the space with their massive forms, their wings spread wide, their eyes blazing with the light of ancient fury. Storm's scales caught the emergency lighting and threw it back like weapons of their own, and Ember's crimson form seemed to glow with contained fire. The Valdran soldiers immediately opened fire, their plasma weapons unleashing a storm of energy bolts that would have instantly vaporized most creatures. But dragons were not most creatures. Their scales were hardened by centuries of evolution in hostile environments, and their reflexes were faster than any technology could match. Storm moved like liquid darkness, his movements confounding the Valdran soldiers, making them fire at positions where he had been rather than where he was. Arya appeared in the doorway behind the dragons, blood dripping from a wound across her forehead, her plasma rifle smoking from recent discharge. She moved with a grace that belied her injuries, crossing the cargo bay in a series of powerful leaps that brought her to Victoria's side in seconds. "We go now," Arya said simply, her hand finding Victoria's and pulling her toward the open doors and the waiting ship beyond. The High Commander shouted orders, calling for more soldiers, calling for reinforcements from the vessels still docked at the station. But there was no time. Storm and Ember forced the Valdran military back, creating a corridor of safety through which Arya and Victoria could reach the open cargo bay entrance. The jump from the cargo bay to the landing platform where Arya's ship waited was perhaps 15 meters, a distance that would be fatal for most beings, but Arya was no ordinary being. She pulled Victoria into her arms and leaped, the two of them flying through the air with Storm and Ember right beside them. The dragon's wings caught them as they fell, supporting their weight and momentum. Carrying them the final distance to the ship's boarding, Ramp Arya practically threw Victoria into the interior of the ship and called out through the open communication channel to Storm and Ember. The dragons launched themselves upward, moving with desperate speed toward the docking clamps that held them to the vessel. They squeezed through the cargo bay door just as the station began its final collapse, the structure coming apart in massive sections that tumbled into the void. The deep space between the stars was quiet and dark, a place where sound could not travel, and where the only light came from distant suns reduced to pinpricks of radiance across millions of kilometers of emptiness. Arya's ship cut through this darkness with its engines running at half power, not to conserve fuel, but to minimize their energy signature. The Valdran Empire maintained patrol ships throughout this region, and the last thing Arya wanted was to draw their attention by creating a bright beacon of electromagnetic radiation that would announce her presence across light years. In the medical bay, Victoria sat on an examination table while Arya tended to her injuries with practiced efficiency. The elf woman had changed out of her damaged environmental suit and now wore simple travel clothes that somehow made her look both more dangerous and more beautiful at the same time. Her silver hair was unbraided now, falling loose across her shoulders like liquid starlight, and her green eyes focused with absolute concentration on the task of ensuring that Victoria was in good physical condition. "You are fortunate," Arya said, her long fingers gently probing Victoria's ribs. "The radiation exposure was minimal, and your lungs show no significant damage from the particulate matter in the air. Another hour in that station and the situation would have been very different. I did not think I would make it out alive." Victoria admitted. When I first sent that signal, I was not even sure anyone would receive it. Earth is so far away and the signal was so weak. I sent it on every frequency I knew, but I did not expect anyone would care enough to answer. Arya paused in her examination and looked directly into Victoria's eyes. I care still. You told me 3 years ago that tomorrow was worth fighting for. That changed me, Victoria. It made me believe that the future might hold something more than endless darkness and slow decline. When I heard your voice on that signal, when I knew that you were in danger, I had no choice but to come. To do otherwise would have been to betray everything you taught me about hope. Victoria felt tears forming in her eyes, tears that she had held back through the entire ordeal of capture and escape. The emotion was overwhelming, the realization that this ancient being, this creature who had already lived for thousands of years and would live for thousands more, had chosen to risk her life for a human who would be dead in 100 years at most. It was overwhelming because it meant that to Arya, duration of life was not the measure of significance. That Victoria's brief existence mattered just as much as the elf woman's eternal one. What will happen now? Victoria asked. The Valdren know what I look like. They will be hunting me. They will be hunting all of us. Arya finished with her medical examination and helped Victoria down from the table. We will go to Earth first. Your people need to know what you have discovered, what you have learned about the Harmony Station and the ancient history of contact between our species. Once that knowledge is public, once it is known to millions of humans, the Valdren will be constrained. They cannot openly attack Earth without the risk of international incident. It is not in their strategic interest to declare war on a planet that has made contact with the elves. But what about you, Arya? Victoria asked. What will happen to you after we reach Earth? Will you stay or will you return to your people and tell them what you have done? Will you face consequences for helping me escape? Arya moved toward the window that looked out onto the void of space, her ancient eyes reflecting the light of distant stars. I no longer consider myself bound by the laws and judgments of my people. I severed those bonds long ago when I began to understand that immortality without connection, wisdom without compassion, is simply a very slow form of death. I will stay with you for as long as you need me, and if my people decide to punish me for that choice, then I will accept their judgment, because some things are worth any price. The conversation was interrupted by Storm's presence in the medical bay. The great dragon had been resting, recovering from the exertion of their escape, but now he was moving again, his nostrils flaring as he sampled the air. Arya turned to him immediately, reading his body language with the ease of someone who had spent the better part of 1,000 years bonded with the creature. Valdren vessels, Arya said aloud. Multiple signatures approaching from the southwest sector. They have picked up our trail. Victoria felt her stomach clench with fear, but Arya did not look afraid. Instead, the elf woman seemed almost calm, as if this were simply another expected complication in an already complicated situation. She moved toward the door, with Storm and Ember following close behind, their dragon eyes alert and focused. The cargo bay will have launched Victoria's ship by now, Arya continued as they moved through the corridors of the vessel. The data is on its way to Earth independent of our movements. Even if the Valdren capture this ship, even if they destroy us, the knowledge will still reach your people. That is what matters. That is the victory that has already been won. In the cockpit, the sensor displays showed the approaching Valdren vessels clearly. 3 military cruisers moving in a coordinated pattern, designed to cut off escape routes and force surrender or combat. Arya began to adjust the ship's course, angling away from Earth and toward a nearby nebula, a region of space so chaotic and difficult to navigate that most conventional vessels would not dare to enter it. Victoria came to stand beside Arya as the elf woman worked the controls. Her hands moving with a precision and speed that seemed almost impossible, the Dragon Princess watched as Arya plotted a course through the nebula, a route that seemed to navigate between clouds of cosmic dust and areas of high radiation with millimeter precision. It was the kind of flying that required not just skill but an almost instinctive understanding of how to read the chaos of space itself. Hold on, Arya said simply, and then she pushed the ship's engines to their maximum capacity. The acceleration was sudden and powerful, pressing Victoria back into a nearby seat. She could see the approaching Valdren cruisers on the view screen, growing larger as they closed the distance. And then Arya made a sharp turn, diving the ship nose first into the nebula at a speed that seemed insanely fast for such a dangerous region. The view outside the window became a chaos of colors and light, swirling clouds of purple and orange and green that seemed to fold in upon themselves in impossible geometries. Victoria's mind reeled, trying to comprehend how Arya could navigate through this at all, let alone at such incredible velocity. Storm and Ember moved to the view screen, their ancient dragon senses somehow adding to the information that the ship's sensors were providing. Between them and Arya, it was as if the ship had 3 navigators instead of 1, each one contributing to the process of threading the needle through the cosmic chaos. The Valdran ships attempted to follow, but they were not as agile as Arya's vessel, and they did not have dragons serving as living augmentation to their navigation systems. One of the cruisers clipped a particularly dense section of the nebula and began to slow, its systems apparently overloaded by radiation. Another cruiser broke off pursuit, deciding that the risk was too great. Only the third ship continued to follow, determined and relentless in its pursuit. Arya made another sharp maneuver, and Victoria saw something impossible happen on the sensors. Arya's ship seemed to phase slightly out of alignment with normal space, not quite disappearing but becoming less substantial, less real in a way that the sensor readouts struggled to process. It was a technique Victoria had never heard of, a technology that should have been impossible. Ancient elven engineering, Arya explained, sensing Victoria's confusion. We have been traveling the stars since before your species learned language. We developed technologies that your scientists are still thousands of years away from discovering. This ship is older than your civilization, Victoria. It has survived the rise and fall of empires. It will not fail me now. The Valdran cruiser attempted to follow through the same maneuver, but something went wrong. The ship's transition into partial phase space seemed to stutter, to falter, and then the vessel began to collapse in on itself, its structure unable to handle the stresses of the maneuver it was not designed for. On the view screen, Victoria watched as the Valdran ship simply ceased to exist, imploding into a point of singularity that briefly burned bright before fading into nothing. Victoria felt sick at the sight, even though she knew that the Valdran soldiers had been trying to kill her, had been willing to destroy entire populations to keep their secrets safe. Arya seemed to sense her distress and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. War is not kind, Victoria. Nor is survival. We did what was necessary. Now we must continue onward. We must reach Earth and ensure that your people understand what you have learned. The future of your entire species depends on that knowledge being shared freely among all humans. As they continued through the nebula, eventually emerging on the other side and plotting a course toward Earth, Victoria found herself thinking about how strange her life had become. 3 years ago, she was simply a human princess, educated in the ways of diplomacy and art, living a sheltered life in orbital stations and Earth's grand cities. Now she was running across the galaxy with an ancient elf warrior and her dragon companions, carrying data that could change the entire trajectory of human civilization. Earth appeared on the view screen like a blue jewel floating in the darkness of space, a world that Arya had not seen in person for over 300 years. The planet had changed in her absence. Cities had risen and fallen, civilizations had come and gone, but the fundamental beauty of the world remained unchanged. White clouds swirled across the surface in intricate patterns, and vast oceans reflected the light of the sun in a way that made the entire world seem almost alive. "This is your home," Arya said softly, her ancient eyes reflecting the light of that distant world. "This is what we have been fighting to protect. This is what your people built without our help, without our interference, simply through their own determination and ingenuity." Victoria came to stand beside the elf woman, placing her hand against the transparent aluminum of the view screen. She could see the political divisions marked out by different colored lights, the human cities that burned bright against the darkness of the night side of the planet. Somewhere down there, her family was waiting for her. Somewhere down there, her government was preparing responses to her disappearance and the loss of her diplomatic ship. "How much time do we have before we arrive?" Victoria asked. "Approximately 18 hours, Arya replied. "In that time, we need to prepare for what will happen when you make contact with your government. The information you have will be revolutionary, but it will also be dangerous. There will be those who want to suppress the data, who want to keep the truth hidden because it threatens their power and their understanding of human history. You must be ready for resistance." Victoria nodded, her mind already racing through the political implications of what she would reveal. The governments of Earth had always maintained that humans developed technology independently, that they were the sole architects of their own destiny. The revelation that ancient elves had made contact with humans, that they had provided assistance in key moments of human development, would fundamentally challenge that narrative. But there was also opportunity in that revelation. If the governments and the people of Earth understood that they had allies among the stars, that they were connected to a larger civilization of beings who valued their potential, it would unite humanity in ways that nothing else could. The petty national conflicts and tribal divisions that had plagued human history might finally be put aside in the face of the larger truth of the cosmos. "What will your people think of all this?" Victoria asked. "When you return to them and tell them what you have done, will they accept it, or will they see you as a traitor?" Arya moved away from the view screen and walked toward the center of the cockpit, her movements graceful despite the weariness that showed in her face. "That is a question that I cannot answer with certainty. Elves do not typically forgive those who break our laws and traditions. But we also do not ignore truth when it is presented clearly. My people will see that you survived because of human courage and human hope. And they may finally understand that we have been wrong to view your kind with such distance and disdain." Storm moved close to Arya and pressed his massive head against her shoulder, offering comfort in the way that only a dragon who had been bonded for centuries could manage. Ember curled up on the floor, her scales reflecting the light from the view screen in a cascade of crimson patterns. "Tell me about them," Victoria said, gesturing toward the dragons. "How did you become bonded with them?" Arya settled into the captain's chair and began to speak, her voice taking on the tones of someone drawing on memories that stretched back longer than most civilizations had existed. "I found them on a dying world, a planet that had been ravaged by war and environmental collapse. The world had been inhabited by a species that had destroyed itself through nuclear conflict and biological warfare. When I arrived, thinking the world was empty, I discovered 2 eggs nestled in a cave, protected by the remnants of ancient technology that the dead civilization had left behind. Most elves would have left them to die," Arya continued. "A species without a civilization, without a culture to pass on to them, would be considered a loss that was not worth preventing. But I could not do that. I took the eggs with me and raised them on my ship, feeding them, teaching them language and thought in the way that dragons can be taught. When they hatched, they bonded with me immediately. They chose me as their family, and I chose them." "That is beautiful," Victoria said, and she meant it. In the human world, such a choice would have been celebrated, honored as an act of compassion and love. But she understood that in the elf world, such choices were often viewed as weakness or sentimentality. Arya gazed at the dragons with eyes that held both ancient wisdom and genuine affection. "They are my salvation in many ways. When I was growing old in spirit, when I believed that immortality without connection or purpose was simply a slow march toward oblivion, they reminded me why life matters. They showed me that love transcends species and time and all the artificial barriers that we build to separate ourselves from one another." Over the next 18 hours, Victoria and Arya prepared for arrival. The human princess worked with the ship's communication systems to compose a message to Earth that would explain her survival and her discovery at the Harmony Station. Arya and the dragons rested, recovering from the physical and emotional toll of their escape. Victoria also spent time reviewing the data that she had successfully transmitted to her ship, ensuring that all of it had arrived intact and was ready for distribution. The data was extraordinary. It contained historical records of ancient human civilizations, not as they were known from human textbooks, but as elves had documented them. There were images and records showing moments of contact between humans and elves. Moments when the elves had chosen to provide knowledge or technology that would help humanity survive catastrophic challenges. There were medical records from ancient times, showing that elf healers had worked to cure human plagues and diseases. There were architectural plans and engineering schematics that had influenced human development without humans realizing the source of the inspiration. What struck Victoria most powerfully was the realization that humanity had never been alone. Humans had believed themselves to be struggling upward from primitive origins entirely through their own efforts. But in truth, there had always been someone watching, someone caring, someone willing to help when the situation became dire enough. As they approached Earth space, Arya made contact with the human orbital defense stations, identifying herself as a peaceful vessel carrying Princess Victoria. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Military ships began to converge on their position, armed and ready, viewing Arya's ship with deep suspicion. Arya did not resist or flee. She allowed the human military to intercept the vessel and guide it to a secured landing site. The landing was at a major spaceport in North America, a place of immense military and political significance. As Arya descended the boarding ramp with Victoria and the two dragons, there were thousands of humans waiting, armed soldiers and medical personnel and government officials. They gasped when they saw Storm and Ember, having never in their lives encountered creatures of such size and magnificence. Victoria stepped forward and spoke with a voice that carried the authority of her royal position. "I am Princess Victoria of Earth, and I have information of critical importance for all of humanity." The elf woman beside me is Arya, an ancient being of wisdom and courage who risked her life to save me, and to preserve information that will change our understanding of our own history. The gathered humans stared at the dragon and the elf, and Victoria could see the fear and wonder mixing together in their expressions. This was a moment that would define the future trajectory of human civilization. Everything that happened in the next few minutes would influence how humans responded to the knowledge of their connection to the larger galactic civilization. Victoria gestured toward the data storage devices that she had brought with her from the Harmony Station. Within these containers is the complete history of contact between humans and elves. It contains the truth about our origins and our potential. I ask that this information be shared with all the people of Earth, not hidden away by governments or kept secret by the powerful. Humanity deserves to know the truth about itself and its place in the cosmos. A human official stepped forward, a woman of perhaps 60 years old, with the bearing of someone who carried significant authority. "I am Dr. Margaret Wells, Chief Administrator of the United Earth Council. We will examine this data with the utmost care and concern. But first, we have many questions for you and for your companion. We need to understand what happened to you and what this information truly represents." Arya stepped forward and bowed slightly in the way of ancient elves, a gesture of respect between equals. "I am willing to answer any questions that your people wish to ask. I have come to understand that humans deserve both truth and transparency. We elves have kept ourselves isolated and separate for too long. It is time for that isolation to end.